obligations under the 1.5 degree Celsius scenario as outlined in the Zero Carbon Act of 2019, and he's been doing that under the banner of the 1.5 project. So Paul's got three big things we're going to be talking about today. If you've got any specific questions about any of the big topics we're talking about, at each of the end of the each section, we'll be going through and taking those questions as we go through, so we don't need to go back to the start of the webinar to talk about each question as they come through. So with that said, I will just hand over to Paul now. So Paul's first question is, what can we as lawyers learn about climate change from the Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand Incorporated and Climate Change Commission JR that was held a few weeks ago?
Wonderful, thanks Cassandra. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Great. So before I embark on the requisite death by PowerPoint, I wanted to give a couple of quick points. The first is this work is now upwards of 3 years old. I started this in late 2018. But having said that, I'm not a climate expert by any stretch. And as we'll see later on, expertise is something which is a hotly debated topic. My PhD is in a field of applied statistics, the mathematics of the signals and position of GPS satellites, so which is not that useful, except it gives me comfort dealing with numbers, and therefore comfort in challenging and poking and prodding the work that's come out of the various bodies. What I'd also say is, in the first section and the first question that Cassandra referred to there, I'll be talking about the difference between Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand, I'll refer to them as LCANZI, and the Climate Change Commission, the Commission. And I think it's worth noting that whilst I'll put on my most objective straight face, I have for the last 2 years taken a position of absolutely supporting the stance that's argued by LCANZI, and have had many discussions with both them and the Commission. So that will no doubt come through in this conversation. Lastly, I'll leave that last bit to the conversation proper. So bear with me while I share a screen. Okay. Now, Cassandra, can you see that? Sorry to make you unmute.
No, we absolutely can. Yes.
Cool, thank you. Okay, so the three things that we'll cover today are: what do Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand, LCANZI, and the Climate Change Commission argue is needed in change over the next decade, and why and how are their positions different? I'll then pause for questions. I'll move into a question of, if we believe the LCANZI pathway, what sectors might deliver this and how? And I'll use Auckland as a detailed example of that. And lastly, I'm going to open a conversation about the critical role of law and what lawyers actually might do to contribute to this. So firstly, LCANZI versus the Commission. This judicial review was heard a couple of weeks ago in a week-long session, which for me was like the World Cup of climate change, and for many in this space, an incredibly incredibly important piece of work. You'll note that I raised a number of issues later on with the Commission's work. What I wanted to highlight before I go into that is that through the whole consultation process, the Commission, Dr. Rod Carr, the CEO, were nothing but gracious and generous with their time. They were wonderful at setting aside time for discussions and debates. And I think, as they've reflected in some of their commentary, their heart is in the right place. They want to do the right thing for New Zealand. So the comments that I make later on should be taken with that backdrop.
Sorry, Paul, could we make the slides, just play the slideshow? So
that's, sorry, play the slideshow?
Yeah, up the top, if you say next to animation, there's slideshow on the tabs.
Up the top. animation. So on my screen, I'm sharing a highlighted What Do Lawyers for Climate Action show?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, above that you've got all the icons, and then above that there's a series in the orange.
Not on my screen.
Okay, this might be a Zoom issue.
What are you seeing?
We're seeing as if you're in PowerPoint rather than showing, like the slides aren't full screen. They're as if you're editing them.
Okay, let me try to transmogrify that again and see if I can get it to work.
It did work in practice, didn't it? Of course.
It did. Yeah. Of course it did.
Yeah.
There we are.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for calling that out. Okay, so jumping straight into it. I want to lean on the work of Associate Professor John Cook from George Mason University, who, over the course of a lot of research and a number of years, has boiled down the climate change story to 10 words. And the reason I do this is because different people join the climate change story at different positions with different beliefs. And in many cases, and the research shows us, these things are gateway beliefs that in many cases impede support for or demand for action. So I want to tell that whole story, and then I'll jump in at a particular point. So you can tell the story in 10 words. It's real. Global warming is actually happening. It's us. That warming is actually caused by humans as opposed to the sun or solar activity or any other things. Experts do agree. There is scientific consensus on human-caused global warming. There is no debate, and there has, in substance, been no debate for a long time, though false media balance has given a different impression. And even today, we run a survey on climate sentiment that we brought down from George Mason University. Around a third of New Zealanders believe that the science is not settled, and as a result are less inclined to act until a decision is made. The fourth point is that it is bad. The impacts of climate change are serious and will affect people and animals and plants. But there is hope. So we have not only the technology, but we have the tools that we need to avoid the worst of it. I'm not going to bother talking about the first three things. I'm going to assume that the people on this call are at the I get it, it's us, everybody agrees, what are we going to do about it? But I am going to jump into the it's bad part of it. And the reason I'm going to do that is because the conclusions that the Commission arrives at versus the conclusions that LCANZI arrive at lead you to different places in the interventions, and the it's bad bit, if looked at through the science, leads you down a particular path. So this is a summary of a paper that was published in November 2019 in Nature. Tim Linton, Professor Will Steffen, and a number of other scientists, and they explored elements in climate change called tipping points or tipping elements. And these are things in the climate system where the climate system can change suddenly, it can change in state, and it can do so in a manner that is irreversible in human timescales. So we might be able to undo it in, for example, 100,000 years, but not in 10 years, decades, or centuries. So they identified this 8 to 10 or so tipping points that themselves are interconnected. I'm not going to go into all of these in detail, but I'm going to highlight three of them to draw attention to the urgency of what we need to do to stay below 1.5 degrees. So the first one on the bottom of the screen is the West Antarctic ice shelf. So this represents around 3 meters of potential sea level rise. We don't know when that will tip irreversibly, but the prevailing thinking is it will probably happen before we get to or around 1.5 degrees of global surface warming temperature. And what that means in practice is it'll probably happen in the next decade. Once that happens, we will have baked in 3 meters of sea level rise that will be irreversible within millennia. it won't happen overnight. It will take small centuries to happen, but it will be baked in. To the north, it has a big sister called the Greenland ice shelf. Here we have 7 meters of sea level rise. The same story is at play. Tipping is near, though probably base case more like the 2030s. Once it does go, then it will do so irreversibly on human timescales. And collectively, those two things point to on the order of 10 meters of sea level rise. Again, not overnight, but within a century or 2 or 3, we will see these things happen. 10 meters of sea level rise, if you look at a map, has quite a lot of impact on quite a lot of people around the world. The last thing I'll draw your attention to is the Amazon rainforest dead center. Now, the Amazon is often called the lungs of the planet. It represents about 6% of the Earth's oxygen generation. Over the last few years, around 200 scientists have gone out with little tape measures and measured around 100,000 trees. So they measure the girth of these trees to understand how their mass is changing over time, or how their diameter is changing over time, to infer whether or not these trees are absorbing more or less carbon. And these trees are just the trees that are intact. So we're not talking about the bits that are being illegally deforested. We're just talking about the intact chunks of the forest. And what they found is the ability of the Amazon rainforest to absorb carbon is in rapid decline. And by their then, 2 years ago, best estimates, the Amazon would shift from a sink absorbing carbon to a source around 2034. So it would functionally collapse as an absorber of carbon, and it would do so on a path to rapid decline. And rapid here, unlike the ice shelves, means that we would see the collapse of the Amazon rainforest in on the order of 1 to 2 decades. It would move to a savanna. Given its stabilizing impact on everything, and that is still being understood, that represents an absolutely catastrophic loss to the planet. More recent work, that was 2.5 years ago that was published, more recent work suggests that tipping point may have already, in terms of the carbon source sink, may have already been crossed. If not, we're getting dangerously close to it. So all of these things are likely, or there is a high risk of them, a growing risk of them tipping as we get closer and closer to 1.5. And 1.5 is most likely going to happen around, on current pathways, early 2030s-ish. And that means our intervention between now and 2030 is of the utmost importance. That's why the mainstream media has been talking about us having a decade to fix this thing. I'll quickly talk as well about the health professionals. We talk about the climate scientists, but there are also health scientists. This, at its core, can be considered, and the World Health Organization considers this the biggest risk to human health this century, climate change. In 2018 and over the last few years, there has been repeated calls from everybody in health to ramp up our action. In this case, a body of health professionals a couple of years ago now said that we need to get to net zero gases by 2040, which is much faster than the mainstream narrative has been arguing. But we're a long way from Paris. So there is a group called the Climate Action Tracker, which is a bunch of universities primarily domiciled in Europe, and they assess the policies, the promises, the action of different countries and the extent to which that is contributing to reductions in temperature increases. So at the moment, in the middle of this chart, you can see where we are at the moment. We're at about 1.1 to 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial averages. 1.5 is the target that has increasingly become the norm we're talking about. And on the left and above that, we can see the various estimates of where we might get to. If we follow real world action based on current policies, we're landing at a world somewhere between 3.6 and 2 degrees, with a middling point of 2.7. If it's the targets only, full implementation of NDC, then it's somewhere between 3 and 1.9. And then you move right to the most optimistic scenario where you put on your full Pollyanna face, and we end up with maybe we're brushing up against 1.5, but more likely sort of 1.8, 2.4. And that's based on vague promises only. So we're a long, long way away from the 1.5 aspiration that has been outlined. And it's also important to note that in substance, this is the same organisation, Climate Action Tracker, their most recent assessment of the different countries' action. And you see their rating in colour down the bottom. On the left-hand side, critically insufficient. To the right-hand side, 1.5 Paris Agreement compatible. There's not a lot of green, and there's actually not a lot of yellow as well. There's a bit of insufficient, and there's a bit of highly insufficient. And what you can see in substance is the most recent assessments show that in substance, New Zealand and Australia are in the same camp in terms of the actual actions that they are taking. So whilst the narrative from Scott Morrison is worlds apart from the narrative from our own Prime Minister, in substance, the policies underneath it are in no meaningful way different. And I think it's important to realise the gap between the rhetoric and the action. So now that's why it's bad, and that's why we need to focus on action that is aligned to keeping the world below 1.5, which in practice needs to happen in the next decade. But there is hope. There is hope that we will be able to achieve that 1.5 if we take appropriate action. And here, this is why the work of the Climate Change Commission versus LCANZI is so important, because it's a question of what is appropriate action. So firstly, there are reasons to be positive. What we're seeing is the narrative in many domains is actually moving towards 1.5. So the Bank of England and the Financial Stability Board, as global entities, have been pushing the financial institutions towards recognition of the risk of inaction in climate change. And that's usually transition risks, so the risk to business models, or physical risks, so the risks to assets, is how it's positioned. In New Zealand, that's led us to the adoption of TCFD reporting, which is becoming mandatory very soon for big entities and funds. New Zealand will be the first in the world that is obliged to report against that. And that is a freight train in reporting that is poorly recognised. So at that level, it's great. We also have some interesting, I guess, green shoots coming out from both the New Zealand government in the form of the 2019 Zero Carbon Act or amendment, and organisations locally like Auckland Council. I think we're seeing similar things out of maybe Dunedin and Wellington, who are actually taking 1.5 aligned action. Lastly, in the bottom image, we have a picture from the protests of way back when people could actually protest physically. And we're seeing the youth rise. And the youth rising is impactful because it's capturing the imagination, it's serving as our conscience, but also in many cases, those youth are talking to their parents and their grandparents who sit in the places of power and actually influencing them. And a good example of this is a very well-known high-profile director was very dismissive of action on climate change. Said director was effectively beaten up by two of her daughters for her position and changed that. And overnight, we saw a shift. So the voice of youth is incredibly important as both a conscience, but also to communicate in a trust-based way with where the power sits. And the power still sits with older grown-ups. Okay. So the key differences between the Commission and LCANZI's arguments, and there's really three key differences. The first is, what are we actually solving for? Like, what's the objective here? The second is, which data sets should we use for the trees? And the third is, given our objective and given the data set we're going to use, how do we actually assess whether our proposed pathways, our proposed actions are compliant, meet the objective? So I'm going to talk through each of those, and I'm going to explain the position in summary that is held by LCANZI and that position that is held by the Commission. I'd also, and I'll highlight this later on, really suggest that you read a wonderful summary called a roadmap from LCANZI, which highlights the 4 grounds on which the judicial review was based, that broadly speaking align with 3 of these points here, and in 4 or 5 pages articulate very crisply for people who love words the difference between the 2 organisations. So the first one I'm going to tackle is so top left, what are we actually solving for? So the Commission argued that the thing they needed to do under statute was hit, in their advice to government, the explicit targets. So the explicit targets were numbered targets for biogenic methane in 2030 and 2050, so that's a number of tonnes per year, and a net zero 2050 target for everything that wasn't biogenic methane. That was primarily what they were solving for and what they thought they were on the hook for. Conversely, LCANZI drew to the purpose of the Act. And I'm paraphrasing here, but the purpose of the Act is to contribute to the global effort to limit the global average temperature increase to 1.5. So it makes explicit 1.5. The reason those 2 things are really, really different is highlighted below in an extract image from figure 3B in the IPCC's special report on 1.5, the summary for policymakers. Below there are, you can see 4 illustrative pathways that they pulled out of some 43 different scenarios that were run and shared. These pathways show reductions in CO2 from 2010 out to 2100. And they show differing levels of action now versus action later on. The thing to really draw your attention here to is the blue line on each of these charts, P1 through to P4. And if you can see my cursor, you see that all of these draw to net zero around 2050. So it is true that net zero 2050, as the Commission argues, is necessary. It is also true that under all scenarios, it is not sufficient. So it's clear from any of these charts that we could get to net zero 2050 by doing pretty much nothing until 2040 and then turning everything off over the following decade. Such a pathway would in no way be compliant with 1.5. There are no pathways underneath the, in fact, there's one pathway, P4, which is, again, you do stuff out to 2040, but you don't do as much. And it assumes carbon capture and storage on an absolutely massive scale. And by the way, that doesn't yet exist. So that's thing one. The Commission thinks it's all about net zero 2050. LCANZI believe it's all about 1.5. So you then jump to which data sets should we use for the trees? And really the debate here is all about the trees. How do we manage forestry in New Zealand? Because it is quite a meaningful driver of the outcomes. The Commission has used a method that is called, or they have called, modified activity-based. It's a Kyoto-based approach that has been used for quite some time. LCANZI, conversely, are arguing that in the Act itself, it explicitly specifies which data set should be used, and that data set is the UNFCCC data set, which is referred to as the GHG inventory. So there's 2 different data sets for trees that are being used that lead to, as you'll see later on, different conclusions. Below, you can see the data from the final advice to government from the Commission, which illustrates those 2 data sets, at least as they looked back then. They've since been updated because our views of forestry removals and additions look different. The green line represents the line argued by the Commission, and the blue line represents the line argued by the UNFCCC. And what you can see, importantly, is there's a big difference in 2010 in what the trees were absorbing of carbon. And that matters because the IPCC's research in 2018 anchors back to 2010. So that's an important reference year. Under the Commission's work, there is a lot less tree removal. Under the LCANZI's work, there's a lot more tree removal. So that makes the world look more favourable through a Commission's world and less favourable through a LCANZI world. Once you get out to 2030, they are slightly different, but they're actually starting to align much more. What that means is if you run a ruler over the historical last 3 decades worth of work, and you then overlay the budgets that are recommended by the Commission, you end up with a very different story. On the left-hand side, we have an extract from the affidavit by Dr. William Taylor, who served as an expert for the Commission. And it shows on the left-hand side that if you use the Commission's modelling approach, or specifically their data sets, you see a gradual reduction from the 2000 to 2010 decade, 2010 to 2020 decade, and the yellow budgets. It kind of glides down, which is broadly aligned with what you would hope would happen, is that the pathway we're proposing for this decade would see emissions decline. Conversely, if you use the data set, which is the UNFCCC data set, and by the way, the UNFCCC data set is the way that every country reports annually in a standardized manner on what their actual emissions in that year are. It is the gold standard for emissions reductions at a global level. It has been accepted by all countries under the UNFCCC framework. So conversely, modified activity-based is not used in that form by all countries, or in fact, that many countries. So on the right-hand side, if you use the LCANZI approach, the UNFCCC approach, what you see is our emissions as proposed under the budgets from the Climate Change Commission will actually grow this decade versus last decade. So that intuitively seems a bit skew, and really is the basis of one of their grounds, is that the recommendations being put forward by the Commission will actually allow increases in emissions this decade rather than decreases in emissions. So lastly, how do you actually assess compliance with the objective? So clearly there's different ways of looking at what the objective is, there's different data sets, but let's say we agree on that. How do you actually assess compliance? The Commission argues a method called gross net, which again harks back to Kyoto work. LCANZI argue that because the Commission used the IPCC's 2018 work, which is the gold standard for 1.5 science, then they should also use the methodology used by the IPCC. And that's called net. So to illustrate the difference between that, below we have the emissions on the left-hand side of this chart. In 2010, CO2, my cursor's hovering over this, where we have gross emissions in 2010 of 35 million tonnes for CO2 only, so I'm ignoring methane. The trees soaked up 30 million tonnes of it, which left us was 5 million tonnes. Now, the Commission starting point is a gross number, though they called it net in their advice. And this gross number, if you take a 50% reduction, 49% per the IPCC, you would end up in 2030 with emissions, permissible net emissions, so that's gross emissions, how much we burn less whatever the trees absorb of, call it 18 million tonnes. Conversely, if you use the IPCC starting point argued by LCANZI, you would start at 5 million tonnes at the bottom, you would take 49% off that, and you would end up at 2.6 million tonnes. So in summary, the Commission is arguing that we should be allowed 17 million tonnes of net emissions in 2030 under their assessment approach, whereas the LCANZI arguing the IPCC is saying we should be able to we should be targeting 2.6 net. So clearly those numbers are like very, very different numbers. If you work through the maths and you use the Commission's position from each side and LCANZI's position from each side, where you get to is that the Commission is arguing approximately a 25% reduction in the use of coal, gas, petrol and diesel by 2030 versus 2019, whereas the LCANZI argued approach, aligned with the IPCC, is arguing a roughly 75% reduction in the use of coal, gas, petrol and diesel by 2030 versus 2019. So the punchline out of this is the recommendations that come out of the conclusions that come out of these two positions are just worlds apart, and therefore warrant exploration through the law and through the judicial review process to see who's got it right and who's got it wrong, and hopefully land on something which looks like the right answer, however you define the right answer. So I'll just pause there. I'll stop sharing, as that's the end of that section, and I'll see whether there are any questions at all on that.
Hi, Paul. We don't have any questions specifically on that point at the moment. While you're presenting, I might just put up the link to the LCANZI News and Resources page, which has not only the roadmap, but it also has all the pleadings, all the evidence, all the submissions. If you're that type of nerd and want to read that, go for it. It's really interesting reading. But as we don't have any other questions, let's turn to the second question.
Yep.
So that's, what are the flow-on effects from LCANZI's position and what needs to be done by New Zealand to meet that position?
Yep, great. I've actually got two questions here. Should I seek to answer those? If you can't see them, Cassandra?
Sure. Sorry, there's one about nuclear, which I thought would come into either two or the final one, but the new one's just come in. Yes, so there's one question. How does the budget advice from the Climate Change Commission work with our NDC and therefore our global accountability?
How does the budget advice work with how does the budget advice from the CCC work with our NDC? So the budget advice, so in terms of what our NDC advice and our budget advice is, I actually can't recall how different or the same they are. And I have to admit that in weighting this story, most of the focus has been on the domestic action as opposed to the international action. Most of the narrative in the mainstream media has focused on the NDC, and that's because the question of compliance with 1.5 was asked explicitly by the minister, and he was forced to address that. And therefore the Commission was forced to address that. Yeah, so I don't have a good answer to that, I'm afraid. I would have to go back and check on it, but I can and will do so and circulate that afterwards.
I can probably add to that, and that LCANZI added an extra ground of review relating to the NDC. I think our position was that if you have a budget that that ends up basically flowing on to the NDC, and for those who don't do a lot of climate change work, NDC is your national determined contributions. So it's basically what we're reporting to the international community as our goal. But it's very much reliant on the Climate Change Commission's advice.
Cool, thanks.
Cassandra, there's a couple of comments too, which you might like to just look at that have just come in.
Certainly. So there's one question. Why has the Commission thought that the MAB assessment approach is credible in light of the UNFCCC standards?
Yeah, so I'll actually jump now to, what I'll do is I'll jump now into some observations that will maybe provide some colour to that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, you know, I'm on track for time, so I will actually jump into this. So some further observations. Firstly, the overarching objective is, it is clear that the Crown lawyers see no obligation to deliver against the 1.5 compliant pathways. This was made explicit during the JR process, and here I quote a source from Stuff who attended, Olivia attended the whole JR digitally. The Crown disputed the headline purpose of the Zero Carbon Act, placed an obligation on the Commission. Appearing in the purpose of the Act, this wording is a broad aspirational statement rather than a duty, Higby, the Crown lawyer, said. Look, an alternative view on that is that this is a critical legal and ethical position, and this will be decided by the courts. Also worth noting that Minister James Shaw has since seemingly disagreed with his own lawyer, and he said, and I quote from Mark Dolder, "I want to be really clear about this. I do not regard 1.5 as merely aspirational. I regard it as absolutely mandatory, and I made a number of statements during the passages of the Zero Carbon Bill to that effect. And I haven't seen the transcript of the case last week, and obviously it's still before the court, so I can't comment specifically on that, but everything flows for me from the requirement to stay within 1.5 degrees of global warming." So look, there's a clear disconnect between the Crown's lawyer and the minister. It's unclear why that has happened. And I'll get to that question in a moment. Well, in my conversations with the Climate Change Commission, of which I had many, the narrative that they talked about is we'll do what seems possible within political and financial constraints without considering too much what is necessary. An alternative view is we'll figure out a way, what science says, we'll figure out what science says is necessary, and then we'll assess that. There's a fundamental difference in the sentiment. In terms of equity and decarbonisation, the Climate Change Commission in their submissions and from the QC who headed this work said, in short, moving more quickly than we propose will be bad for vulnerable people, in particular Māori. The Commission explained that trying to meet the current NDC solely through domestic action at this early stage in our transition would be highly challenging, risk severe social and economic impacts on New Zealand, have a legacy impact on the quality of life of younger generations, and disproportionately impact Māori. That is almost humorously at odds with the story that is coming out from the IPCC, which came out that week and said, and I quote from Stuff again, citing IPCC, they spoke to authors of the IPCC AR6 report and said that the evidence showed the poor and the vulnerable people, both globally and in New Zealand, will be worse hit by heat stress, loss of insurance, economic insecurity, and other impacts. Mistakes and expertise. The Climate Change Commission really took exception to the idea that they may have made a mistake. They argued quite explicitly if this was an error, they would have picked it up, to which I would point them to the Mars lander in 1999 that hit the ground at 5,000 kilometres an hour because they mistook inches from millimetres. Experts do make mistakes. And I think in terms of the Commission's view of what expertise, again, this comes through in the affidavits, their view of an expert is someone who is very good at climate accounting, and they were dismissive of the experts that LCANZI drew on. For example, they said that the IPCC co-author on 1.5 compliant pathways was not an appropriate expert to address this issue. So, look, it is very clear, and LCANZI's experts were very clear, and they include world-leading scientists, that a mathematical error had been made by the Commission. We'll say one more thing. The counterfactual. The Climate Change Commission, we had all assumed that if the Climate Change Commission was forced through the courts to use a different approach, that they would use a different approach, but still lean on the IPCC SR 1.5 2018. But what they argued is that if the Commission was forced to use a net pathway, then it would simply not use the IPCC work. Now, if my jaw could hit the deck, it would have done so when I heard this. The IPCC is the gold standard for globally agreed science. And the Commission saying that if it is forced to use the methodology that the IPCC has used to make its advice, then it will simply not use the IPCC's work, raises massive questions about what's going on within the Commission. If they're not to do that, then what? And why take this stance? So those observations I'll use as context to the question that was posed there. And I'd say that why did they choose to use Kyoto accounting, MAB accounting? Look, they believed it was the right thing. In my opinion, I think two things will at play here. I think the Commission hired the wrong experts. They hired climate change accounting experts steeped in 30-year-old, very politically driven accounting standards, which are valid, rather than hiring for climate scientists who could contribute to finding the purpose of meeting the purpose of the Act. The second thing, and James Every Palmer talked about this and was responded to dismissively, is I think they fell into groupthink. If you look at the experts, no independent experts, and truly independent, not associated with MFE or the Commission, were engaged by the Commission. And they all came from a background of Kyoto accounting. And I think groupthink happens. We know from psychology groupthink happens. So I think they fell into groupthink. I'll actually push on now to the next section. This is the first time I've given this section in the current form, and I want to make sure that I stay within time. So what sort of changes are needed to CO2 between now and now? I'm going to use 2019 as a reference case because it's the most recent data set, in 2030, if you believe LCANZI's argument. So if we look at the emissions in 2019, there was 37 million tonnes of gross emissions. And you may recall in one of the previous charts, under the LCANZI argument, which is the IPCC methodology, the UNFCCC data set, and the purpose 1.5, you need to get down to about 2.6 million tonnes. So we need to go from gross emissions and CO2 only. I'm disregarding the cows, the methane, because that's not contested. The nitrous oxide is not contested. And I'm only talking about CO2. Fortunately, in 2019, there was a bunch of trees that were absorbing CO2. So 28 million tonnes of that 37 was absorbed by trees, meaning our net emissions in 2019 were 10 million tonnes. So all else equal, if the trees carried on doing what trees do at the same rate, and we carried on polluting in the same way we did, we would have to get from 10 million tonnes down to 2.6 million tonnes between 2019 and 2030. Unfortunately, what's actually happened over the last, what will happen over the next decade between now and 2030, is we're going to move into a period of extensive harvesting of our forests. And that what that means is the absorptive capacity of those forests will be seriously curtailed versus 2019. In fact, what it does is it effectively triples, adds 21 million tonnes to the emissions that the climate will see by 2030, based on current best guesses of what the harvesting cycle over the next decade will look like. And that means that by 2030, if we were to emit the same emissions, so drive the same kilometres, use the same coal, burn the same gas in our barbecues, and assume that the harvesting is as proposed, our net emissions would be 31 million tonnes. So that's the problem to solve. The problem to solve is, how do we get from 31 million tonnes down to 2.6 million tonnes by 2030? And that in practice, that means we need a roughly 75% reduction in the use of petrol, diesel, coal, and gas between 2019 and 2030. And 2019 and now are kind of roughly speaking the same. So as a proxy, we need to reduce by 3/4 the use of those four things in 8 years-ish.
Sorry, Paul, do you have slides for this?
Am I not sharing this?
No. Turns it off for the Q&A.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Okay. Okay.
Perfect.
So
thank you.
That's important. So I'm just going to go back one slide, and I won't revisit the whole thing, but I'll just cover it. So what you can see is 37 million tonnes of gross emissions in 2019. 28 million tonnes was soaked up by the trees. leaving 29, in 2019, we had 10 million tonnes of net emissions. All else equal, we would have had to reduce from 10 down to 2.6 by 2030. Unfortunately, we'll be pulling 21 million tonnes of trees out. We're harvesting trees, which means our actual emissions will increase by a factor of 3. So if we assume the same pollution as 2019 and 2030, and we assume the harvesting happens as proposed, we will be back at 31 million tonnes by 2030. So we have to find 28 million tonnes of reductions between now, roughly, and 2030. So that's call it 28% reduction between the 37 million tonnes of pollution and the 28 million tonnes of pollution that we need to have. So I'm now going to jump to where that pollution comes to and an assessment of where we might get our emissions from. This is a conclusion that is a synthesis of technology, economics, politics, and to the extent available, law. Reasonable people might come up with different conclusions to this, and I will highlight at the end why one might come up with a different conclusion. So firstly, I'm going to talk through where these emissions are coming from. Energy industries, 5 million of 37 million tonnes is coming from making electricity and producing petrol and diesel at a refining in New Zealand. Roughly 4 out of electricity and 1 out of refining New Zealand. Industrial processes and product use, this is chemical processes which emit CO2. Rio Tinto makes aluminium, BlueScope steel at Glenbrook, Golden Bay cement. These categories, these companies on the right-hand side represent typically 50 to 70% of this category. Manufacturing industries and construction, 2 to 2.5 million tonnes of this is Fonterra burning coal and gas to dry dairy milk, which is sent overseas, to dry milk sent overseas, and about 1.5 is Methanex making methane in Taranaki. After that, you end up with rats and mice manufacturing stuff with gas and coal. Road transportation is the biggest single category. It represents 15 million tonnes and is represented by those who are selling the liquids themselves, but also those who are selling the machines that burn the liquid. Here I use the car companies as examples. And on top of that, we might have illustrations of the companies that are using the machines that burn the liquid fuels. So Main Freight, for example. There's 2 other groups that I'll highlight here that are contributing to this. So we have the banks at the moment that are continuing to finance climate change. And whilst those banks are in a very emergent manner doing stuff on climate change, in substance, they're not doing anything of note. They are still financing all of these companies. They are still not asking whether or not your funding is going to an electric car versus a petrol car. So the banks are still, for the most part, complicit with the ongoing climate crisis. The other group of actors that have not yet come to the party, and if you're looking favourably at it, you'd say they just haven't got to it yet. If you're looking less favourably, you'd say they're complicit, is the big 4 accounting firms who are in an audit function thus far not joining the dots between the change that is needed in these assets in order to align with the Act, depending on what you believe in the Act, and what those companies are doing. So, for example, if you believe the argument I've just presented around a 75% reduction in petrol and diesel by 2030, and you believe that flows from the Act, then there is no way that Z Energy's market value or asset value holds at all. There is no way that Refining New Zealand's asset value holds at all. There is no way that Vector Gas, who distribute the gas around Auckland and have a 40-year life cycle, have an asset value anywhere near that. So thus far, they haven't yet started challenging that. So what that means is we need to find 28 million tonnes of reductions from the 37 million tonnes up the top. I'll now step through where that might come through. And again, reasonable people might disagree with this. We won't get much out of agriculture, and the reason for that is the agriculture sector, one, this is not methane, the lion's share of it, but two, the agriculture sector has not yet agreed at scale that there is a need for transformation of the nature needed. So politically, there is low will to do that. So I take a 10% reduction broadly in line with what's needed out of methane. Across the four other areas, so the top one, other, fugitives, aviation, waste. Now, fugitives is leaky gas pipes, that's one. So I've assumed that that will be plugged by 2030. Aviation is just shy of 1 in 2019. And what we're seeing increasingly is companies are moving away from flying through flight shame. Clearly, COVID has knocked that a lot, but it's unclear that it'll come back. So I've assumed that around half of that disappears, half of the seat kilometres disappear by 2030. Underneath that, we end up with industrial, commercial, and domestic use of gas for heating in a large part. And I've assumed that we reduce that by about 50%. There are currently no initiatives underway to do that at that scale, but I've assumed that for now. So that gives you 4. Energy industries of 5 million tonnes now, we might get 4 out. We know that refining, New Zealand has shut down the refining, and that's where most of the emissions come from. That gives us 1. We also know that we are moving down a pathway of decarbonisation of the electricity sector. If you believe the Commission's conservative forecast, then that gets us to around a 3 to 4 million tonne reduction by 2030. So these are reductions, not absolute positions. So industrial process and product use, incredibly hard to fix. This is Glenbrook, it's the aluminium, it's glass, it's cement. You either close them and you move them over the seas, or you implement new, completely new processes like hydrogen steel. There's no indication of a desire to do that. I've assumed that the aluminium smelter closes. We get about a 1 out of that. It does move those emissions overseas, but it gives us a 1 on our scoreboard. I've also assumed that Fonterra, under a basic license, social license to operate, recognises that it can no longer burn coal to dry dairy to dry milk, and shuts down in a more accelerated manner than currently proposed. In fact, the dairy sector does that. Similarly, that other players in the manufacturing industry more aggressively move. So this is a fairly aggressive reduction, nowhere near what's proposed today. So that's a 5 on 8 reduction. So if you do the maths here, I've managed to find about 14 million tonnes of the 28 million tonnes of reduction I need to get there. The only thing left is road transportation. And the punchline from that is, if you believe the forestry reductions that are coming in order for the country to deliver on a 1.5 compliant pathway aligned with what the IPCC and LCANZI are arguing, then we need to largely decarbonise road transportation by 2030. So we need to largely get rid of petrol and diesel by 2030. So that's awkward, but it is possible. And so whilst that seems a bit crazy, what we see is increasingly bodies are adopting this. So in 2018, Auckland Council adopted, under their C40 cities membership, 1.5 just compliant pathway. Their climate change policy came out, and what they saw from that is that different sectors would fall different amounts. For example, stationary energy would fall 65%. So that means 65% less gas, for the most part, flowing through Vector's gas pipelines. Transportation would fall by 64%. There would be 64% less petrol and diesel being sold in the region, while the population grows by 20%. So on a per person basis, that 64% transport is about a 75% reduction on a per person basis. So whilst my previous recommendation was about a 90% reduction, and that seems a bit crazy, what we're now seeing is other organisations are increasingly agreeing that these are the numbers that are needed in science to deliver on a 1.5 compliant pathway. What's also really clear, and it highlights the difference between the Commission's work, is if we look at the Commission's recommendations of 2016 versus 2030 versus Auckland Council, they are just worlds apart. So the agriculture has assumed, the Commission has assumed 10% across agriculture. That's mainly methane by 2030. This is a 2016 baseline, but it's more or less the same. Auckland Council is more aggressive. They have a 15% reduction. In stationary energy, the Climate Change Commission has assumed a 33% reduction by 2030. Auckland has assumed a 65% and is targeting 65%. In transport, the Climate Change Commission recommends only a 6% reduction in transportation versus 2016, whereas Auckland is saying 64%. IPPU, so Glenbrook, et cetera, the numbers are similar. So they draw a similar conclusion. These things are hard to close or fix. Waste under the Climate Change Commission is actually much more aggressive, though it is a much smaller size of a prize. So if we look at this in total reductions across the Commission versus Auckland, we see that the Commission is proposing a 16% reduction, whereas Auckland is proposing a 50% reduction. And I do that just to highlight the absolutely massive gap between the Commission's recommendations and other organisations that are targeting a 1.5 aligned pathway. So I'm now going to stop sharing this and I'm going to jump into a tool that shows actually that's possible. So in 2019, I concluded I'm going to dig in on Auckland and I'm going to dig in on transport and show that this is not as crazy as it might first seem. So in 2019, late 2019, after the original analysis that concluded we need to largely decarbonise road transportation, I started talking about that. And bar the CEO of a large petrol and diesel company, no one could disagree with the essence of the conclusions. The work needed a solution, though, in transportation, and I ran an analysis of the proposed $30 billion spend under Auckland Transport and Auckland Council's transport plan. And what that told me is that it looked like under that plan, emissions after spending $30 billion would actually increase by 5 or 10%, which seemed crazy and at complete odds with what the public narrative was saying. So I shared this with a company called LCANZI, and they are a transport consultancy, and they were initially skeptical, but after a number of meetings in 2019, they decided to set up an internal team to cross-check to validate this work. I met with them in early 2020, and the CEO said to me, look, we'd hoped that you'd missed a zero in some of your calculations, but we've come at this a different way. And in summary, you're bang on. And no one knows this, and we think it's really important to start a conversation around how we might think about transportation in New Zealand and in Auckland. And I'll just highlight LCANZI here as an example of leadership. So these guys jumped in and they committed real resource to have a real conversation that was really awkward with their clients, because it basically said, your plan's terrible. But in doing so, they took the side of science, they took the side of future generations, and they informed the conversation in a fact and science-based way that has had a massive influence on the discourse over the last while. So I'm now going to run you through that, and this is a tool that I have used to share with many, many people over the last couple of years, including the Prime Minister Cabinet, to illustrate the scale of change that's actually needed and where that might come from in transportation. So let me see, and please, Cassandra, could you confirm that this picture is up?
It's up, yes. And we'll provide a link afterwards, won't we?
Great, yes, absolutely. So this is Transport 2030. Anybody can go, 2030.org, anybody can go to this and play with it. It's been done for Auckland and Victoria publicly. It's actually been done for Christchurch as well, but that hasn't been released. And it's being done, I understand, for all regions in the country. What it does is it allows you to flex different policies, different investment projects, and understand the implications of those policies and projects on emissions. So on the top right, you can see a red bar 2018 2813. That illustrates the emissions from road transportation moving people only. It doesn't talk about freight. people only in 2018. It also talks about a 2030 baseline, were we to do nothing but to travel around more or less as we do now. So we see that on population alone, emissions would grow from 2813 to about 3580. We then have a scenario generator to the extreme right of this on the top of this chart, which is the scenario generator. As I turn scenarios on and off, this will move. There are then two targets. The yellow line illustrates everybody dropping their emissions by 50%. So Glenbrook would half close. It can't half close, so you'd shut it down. Glass Industries would half close. Would send half of the cows to Wisconsin as barbecue. For those reasons, that's quite hard. So you end up back down at a line, the green line, which is more like the 65-70% line that Auckland Council is now actually targeting. So what we need to do is get the right-hand bar down to the green line. So I'm going to do this in two ways. Firstly, I'm going to show the current plan as being delivered following $30+ billion of spend led by the council and Auckland Transport. So firstly, you will have heard about the City Rail link. It will be completed at this cost of around another $5 billion-ish. You'll see the number moving. So that additional $5 billion takes 3580 down to 3552. If you assume the City Rail link is finished by 2030 and is full. Secondly, we have been talking about various flavours of two light rail projects. Now, we don't know what form they're going to take. We don't know how much they're going to cost, but nobody thinks it's going to be less than $20 to $25 billion for both. So I'll turn both of those on. I'll assume that they're both complete and full by 2030. No one thinks that's going to happen. So we're real Pollyanna land here. And what we see is that the number goes down a little bit. I'll then turn on, in the interest of speed, the other big projects, the Airport to Botany project, Esmus Crosstown. These are mainly busway projects. We've burnt through well north of $25 billion over the next day. It's close to $30 billion in infrastructure projects. We've got to 3419, remembering we've got to get to the green line. Cassandra, can you see that moving on your screen?
Your mouse?
No, the top right bar.
Yes, it's coming through, Paul, like Fiona here.
Thank you. I'll then turn on the cycling investment plan. So this is a cycling investment plan which hasn't been delivered, has been about half behind for a couple of years. So what you see is that actually moves things quite a lot. And in fact, in terms of a carbon reduction per dollar of spent, it's roughly 6 times better than those other projects, which doesn't mean those other projects are not great. Like airport to like light rail projects are great projects. City Rail Link projects are great projects, but they're not carbon projects. They're not climate projects on this timeline. We also have bus electrification. We don't know where that's going to happen. I'll just assume the buses get all electrified, all 1,300 of them in 2022. It's a rounding error. Buses are very emotive, but don't move the dial. Car electrification, that will happen a bit under current market and now the more recent policies from central government, but not that much. So what we see is we've now spent $30 billion. This is the current AT plan, and we see that emissions in 2030 have grown from 2.8 million tonnes to 2.990 million tonnes. So it's kind of call it a 5-ish% increase. That represents the RLTP that was signed off by Auckland Transport, Auckland Council, and a cast of other very learned transport bodies in the middle of last year. So in spite of the council agreeing to a 64% reduction, they signed off this $30 billion program. And that is, funnily enough, the basis of the all-aboard judicial review between all of those actors and a group of mild-mannered advocates, which will be heard in a few weeks. So that's a terrible plan. I'm now going to turn those things off, and I'm going to show you what an alternative plan might look like. So I'll turn off all of those projects. Turn off car electrification. And I'm going to show an alternative pathway to illustrate we can actually largely decarbonise transportation in a decade. Firstly, look, in the interests of conflict, we'll knock off the City Rail link. We'll give them one of the light rail projects. It doesn't do anything meaningful on climate, but it does build the city of the future. I'll then also start talking about two important levers. We'll start to reduce the number of trips that are actually taken. So let's talk about things like 4-day weeks. Let's talk about going shopping less frequently than we might otherwise do. If we were to just reduce the number of trips taken by 10% over a decade, so 1% per year over a decade, we see that one thing has more impact than the $30 billion we're about to spend. If in addition to that, we live more local, and we know we can live more local because we did so under COVID, we allow the local shops to flourish, we travel less to the shopping centres at the end of the motorway. If we do that just to the tune of 10% and we build our local communities, we're actually back at where we need to be, where we were in 2018. So two initiatives, they're not about infrastructure, they're just about changing the way we live our lives. So they are about a big behavioural change, but we don't need to pour any concrete for these. In addition to that, I'll advocate that we reach the level of cycling that Copenhagen has. And not the tiny cobblestone area, but the greater region. And this is an area similar in size and in density to Auckland. And what we see is that takes us below. In fact, it's the biggest, most impactful thing we could do. In order to do this, we will have to reallocate road space at significant scale, like Paris is doing, like other cities are doing. We will have to remove currently public parking from main corridors. We will have to reallocate around a quarter to a third of the current road space to public and active modes of transport so that people can get around safely and equitably. It won't cost us much because you need planter boxes, but it will be politically challenging. I want to electrify the buses. We probably should, but they're expensive. We'll follow Norway in their adoption of electric vehicles. And that will give us roughly a third of our fleet by 2030 electrification. We'll also introduce car emission standards. We'll get to the point where in 2030, the average car in the fleet has emissions no greater than the average new car in Japan in 2014. We know we can do that by bringing in car standards. What it means in practice is that we will have no cars with emissions greater than a Prius coming into New Zealand by 2025. So clean car standards, much more aggressive than currently proposed, car electrification, and increasing car occupancy, which is a proxy for taking cars off the road, by around 10%. So we eliminate this one person per car into the city thing. And we're kind of back to where we need to be. In addition to that, bottom right, so we've reduced our emissions by 70%. We've spent about $20 billion less than we were otherwise going to spend. And bottom right, cars on the road, we've actually made it easier to travel around the city for people that do need to do so in a car. There are less cars, around 20% less cars on the road in 2030 than there were in 2018, the baseline year. So I'll pause there and to see if there are any questions to that for maybe 5 minutes, and then I'll move on to the closing section.
Thanks, Paul. So there's a few questions around transport that now might be a good time to answer. So the first is, do we expect that larger projects will simply just stop being suggested or stop getting off the ground given the climate impacts of them?
Look, it hasn't been discussed, and there's a disconnect here, or not a disconnect, but these projects are generally great projects for our future cities. And look, the big ones that are burning steel and concrete are the light rail and the city rail link. So, nobody is arguing that they shouldn't necessarily be done for the city we want and the public transport system we want in the future, but we need to shift away from this narrative that they have any meaningful impact on climate over the period we care about, and in fact, they make it worse. So given that, we should be somehow correcting our other behaviours to allow for that.
Sure. And the figures we've been using today, are they taking into account the carbon emissions of simply building the roads and the concrete in them, or is it purely around looking at the emissions of the cars on them?
Yeah, so those calculations only consider the emissions from the fleet. They don't consider the emissions associated with building more roads, of which there is much. I mean, one project recently, which was fortunately shut down, was Mill Road. That would have burnt a lot of emissions being built, and it would have actually, by most people's calcs, not Auckland Transport's, but most people's, would have increased emissions as well. So it doesn't consider either of those two things.
Sure. And then the other question was, I'm going to go broader than the question, but conceptually, when we're looking at these local effects, should we be looking more globally and saying, if we funded nuclear power in India or Africa, we're going to actually reduce a lot more carbon emissions than what we're doing in New Zealand, and that's probably better globally?
Yeah, so this is the offshore, the offsetting question. I think that's the spirit of that makes sense, as long as you've got your house in order first. And I think if you believe the analysis that I've just shared, and in fact, this is also represented in analysis from MFE that basically say the decarbonisation of the transportation sector is cost negative. It's actually economically positive for New Zealand. And really rough numbers, we're spending between $6 and $8 billion a year on petrol and diesel. If we're just to electrify everything, which I'm not advocating we do, in fact, we should electrify maybe half of the stuff, then we'd be spending about $1 billion a year. So we're saving on an annual basis about $7 billion a year just from doing it here. So the question that's posed is a valid thought exercise, but to get there, you first have to believe you've done everything you can do in New Zealand. And we're just a million miles away from that at the moment.
Sure. So what analysis has been done on the economic impacts of the solutions you've just proposed to us, for instance, changes in consumption spending?
So changes in consumption spending. So there has not been a detailed economic analysis on, for example, what would happen if households spend, because for most people, transport spend is the biggest energy spend. What would be the consequences of that? Beyond the flow-on effect of it would put more money in their pockets. We know, for instance, that the increase in petrol prices that's happened most recently, most greatly impacts those that are the most vulnerable. If we move to a transportation system akin to what I've just proposed, that would put a lot of money back in. So we've done that micro-analysis, but there hasn't been a national economic modelling exercise of what that would look like.
Sure. And then I guess for non-Aucklanders, how can the modelling you're doing apply to other cities and centres? Yeah, so
the approach to this is absolutely valid for all urban centres, and will be available, I hope, soon for all urban centres. But the methodology is very transparent and well documented. The rural story is different because the distances are greater and the use case is different. And the punchline there is electrify the farm. And so what we need to do is more aggressively support farmers to shift away from the use of liquid fuels to electrifying everything on their farms, from on-farm equipment to the stuff they use to get around.
Sure. We've got a few equity questions coming through. I think I might save that for the end because I'm conscious of time, and that is, 3 hours of conversation easily. So let's quickly turn to the final portion of the webinar, which is discussing what lawyers can be doing better.
Yep. So sorry, so one quick comment I want to make on equity, because we may run out of time, is that that's absolutely central to everything. There is a mainstream narrative which has been supported by the Commission and which is, in many opinions, false. And that is that this transition to the transport system I propose will impact negatively the most vulnerable. That is a flawed conclusion, primarily because those people are currently in time and transport poverty today, and we can very, very cost effectively provide them with safe access to alternative transports for many of their use cases. And here someone always raises the question about the guy that needs to move a piano from South Auckland to Auckland, and he can't do that. So we're not talking about every case, but we don't need to solve for every case. We need to solve for many cases. And the solution proposed here are supported by all of the equity, all of the advocacy community as equitable transformations. There is a need for local government to get serious about the reallocation of road space and support for e-bikes, for example, for those that can't afford it. So I'll move into the last section. And
Do you have slides for this section? Yes.
There are slides, not many, but there are.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to share this. Now, can you see that as, bear with me, can you see that?
I can share it, but it's not playing.
I'll just reshare that. Okay.
Perfect.
So I really wanted to, this is a tough one, you know, how do you tell 300 or 400 lawyers what they should do? It's always going to be dangerous territory. So I wanted to talk about this through the voice of an advocate, or some might call an activist, and use the words power and empowerment, and use my own experience here. So in terms of power, if we look at, as I talked to lawyers in this space, I asked the question, why is it that the law firms and lawyers are not doing what was done by professional services firms around the Adani mine in Australia? And what they did, and what the advocacy community did, was they basically vilified anybody that was supporting in any way engineering firms, insurance firms, transport firms, the deployment of a coal mine that on any basis was crazy. And what I was told by lawyers was words like cab rank and conflict and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you then jump into a question of, well, okay, it looks like those who are advocating for the future are kind of always on the back foot. And if I draw your attention to a couple of current cases that are flowing through, Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand versus the Climate Change Commission. On one side, you had Crown Law, the largest litigation firm in the country. On the other side, you had a bunch of pro bono people. All Aboard Auckland, which is coming up. On one side, you have Simpson and Grierson, Auckland Council, AT funding them six-figure sums. On the other side, you have All Aboard Auckland, which is a bunch of, you know, there's a mild-mannered packaging guy, there's someone who has an IT firm, there's someone who does design, but these are just people that care about the topic. Smith versus Fonterra, this is hilarious. So you have Fonterra, Genesis, Dairy Holdings, New Zealand Steel, New Zealand Steel, Z Energy, New Zealand Refining, BT Mining, represented by Chapman Tripp, Bell Gully, Buttle Finlay, Minter Ellison, Rudd Watt. On the other side, you have sort of well-intentioned pro bono people, and I could go on, but on one side, you have the power sits with the establishment, and the establishment looks to us like it's primarily by headcount lawyers. On the other side of the coin, you have empowerment, and I want to draw your attention here to the work of LCANZI. In 2020, Jenny Cooper from LCANZI, myself and Lucy Lawless, of all people, presented to a bunch of advocates on what was needed, the story I've just shared, and Jenny presented what the law demanded. And what we saw after that is the advocacy community was massively empowered by this. They really, really believed that suddenly they had someone in their camp. And it was like a scene from a Marvel movie where the hero finally appeared. And since then, we have seen massive empowerment amongst that community because they have legal expertise on their side. Now, still small, LCANZI is 300 or so lawyers of 15,000 lawyers in New Zealand. So whilst they are punching massively above their weight, they are still small. And what we would love to see is more of that. So if I then jump to a thought starter for what might happen, for what lawyers might do. Firstly, get informed. Read the summary for policymakers from the IPCC. Read LCANZI's roadmap. It summarises what's needed. Form a view on whether you believe the Climate Change Commission, a 25% reduction, or whether you believe LCANZI and the IPCC. Join Lawyers for Climate Action. Give them more money than they ask for. If you're a partner in a law firm, think about giving them $1,000 to $5,000 a year so that we can start to build a war chest to actually challenge the status quo, because the status quo is being represented by lawyers that are well-resourced today. Thirdly, talk about climate change. And here I point to Jess Berensson-Shaw's work, which shows you how to respectfully talk about climate change. And lastly, think about fundamental changes to the way that the law works. And here, the Law Society of England and Wales has recently adopted a climate change resolution. And I don't know whether that is valid in New Zealand, but I'll draw your attention to this and quote from part of that. So UK Law Society is committed as follows. It revolves to develop plans and take rapid action in a manner which is consistent with restricting global warming to 1.5C by adopting science-based targets. It's clause 1 of the resolution, and I won't go on, but they are taking an incredibly, you might call it aggressive stance to shifting the actions of the legal community in favour of future generations and equitable climate action. And it would be wonderful if it were appropriate for similar action to take place here. And I'd encourage everyone here to contact whoever the president or the head of or the director of the New Zealand Law Society to advocate for adopting or discussing in the first instance such a pathway. And with that, and with 4 minutes to close, I will stop sharing and see whether there is any further questions.
So we've got a lot of questions around communication of climate change issues. So I think I can summarize most of them in how do we best communicate these issues and how do we depoliticize these issues?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think the basis of this is to really understand, our basis of this is to really understand the science and understand the scale and rate of change that's needed. So what we're seeing is and the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Many people are advocating climate action absent an understanding of the scale and rate of change needed. Firstly, become informed on that, and then form a view on what that appropriate action looks like. And maybe it looks like LCANZI, maybe it looks like the Commission. Once you know what that looks like, you then know what your target is. And you then end up to, in the first instance, doing two things. In your personal capacity, rather than talking about house prices and where you're going on holiday, talk about climate change and bring this information to bear. Bring a conversation to bear that says, we need to largely eliminate petrol and diesel by 2030. We need to stop importing Ford Rangers. We need to make sure that we reallocate our streets, for example. And there's loads of material on that. In your professional lives, whether you're serving clients or working internally, make sure that that truth that we talk about, the scale of change needed, is brought to bear everywhere. So, for example, if you're working within Z Energy and the legal team, make sure that everybody knows there's a scenario where there is a 75% reduction in petrol and diesel within 8 years. That is a risk you should be considering. It's a risk you should be bringing to every single conversation that you have. Beyond that, learn how to do it, and I would suggest reading Jess Berensson-Shaw's very readable brief book.
And then I think the final question we have time for is, what can elected officials be doing to accelerate these mitigation and transformation initiatives?
Yeah, so we have local government and we have central government. Central government currently is in a really difficult position because of where the Commission has landed, which is weak targets versus science in the opinion of many. Hopefully that will be resolved soon. And it's difficult for them to step beyond the Commission. Local government can and are doing this. What we're seeing is failures to actually enact this in practice. So, for example, there is a statement of intent from Auckland Transport to Auckland Council. For 2 years, they have failed consistently to put climate targets in it. They have an opportunity to do that again now. If they fail to do that again, then that is really a failure and abdication of responsibility on the part of those elected officials and of the Board of Auckland Transport. So those people know what they need to do. They just need to do it. And they need to seek the support of the advocacy community, who would love to see them do more in time.
Wonderful. So that's 11 o'clock. Thank you, Paul. That was really, even for someone like me who lives this life, it's very, very informative, and I learned a lot from it. So thank you for that.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you to both of you on behalf of NZLS, and thanks for everyone who joined today. Lots of questions, lots of engagement. So really appreciate, Paul, you presenting to us today. It was fantastic. And go well, everyone. Mā te wā.